I'm Jeremy Scahill from Dropsite News. You're about to hear the premiere episode of our new investigative podcast series, The Palestine Laboratory, from journalist Antony Loewenstein. The project would not be possible without the support of our readers and listeners. If you're a free subscriber to Dropsite News, consider upgrading your subscription to a paid one today. To get a 20% discount, you can head to dropsitenews.com/PalestineLab. That's dropsitenews.com/PalestineLab. You can also make a tax-deductible 501c3 donation to support all of our work at donate.dropsitenews.com. Thank you so much for reading and listening.
There's a story Israel tells about itself, one that celebrates innovation and tech.
God brought us into a neighborhood that was surrounded by enemies. And because of that, the people of Israel had to be creative.
Of how Israel became a world leader in developing surveillance and military hardware.
In Tel Aviv, you can't walk 2 blocks without coming across the offices of a high-tech company, from startups to major international corporations to accelerators and everything in between.
I'm Antony Loewenstein, an investigative journalist, and I've been uncovering Israel's military and surveillance tech industry for more than a decade. And what's missing from this story is that it's all built in the Palestine Laboratory.
Because as Loewenstein writes, Israel has developed a world-class weapons industry with equipment conveniently tested on occupied Palestinians, then marketed as battle-tested. The Palestine Laboratory is a signature Israeli selling point.
This story is as old as the state of Israel itself, but since October 7, the Palestine Laboratory is accelerating. And they're testing new weapons in Gaza as we speak.
Very, very, very near to our hospital. This is happening right now, as you see.
In this 4-part series, I'll speak to people who have never spoken out before and investigate how Israel exports the technology of occupation around the world.
3 Israeli companies are profiting from the war in Gaza. These companies have experienced a significant surge in profits. Israel Aerospace Industries, Rafale Advanced Defense Systems, and Elbit Systems.
How did the small state of Israel become one of the world's leading arms and tech exporters? And what does this mean for warfare and the future of Palestine? To begin to look at these questions, we need to go back in time.
And I therefore formally declare Israel admitted to membership in the United Nations.
To even before the State of Israel was established in 1948, when Palestine was under British colonial rule, where a small group of underground Jewish militias and influential British officers set off a chain of events that's still in motion today.
An Arab Palestine is a threat to Great Britain and a menace to the world. A Jewish Palestine is an asset to Great Britain and a blessing for the world.
This is the Palestine Laboratory. Episode 1, The Startup Nation.
Destination is on the left.
It's March 2024, in the middle of Ramadan.
For now, maybe someone wants to get out. I'll park here for now.
I've just arrived in a small town about an hour and a half's drive north of Sydney to visit an old friend.
Hi. Is everyone sleeping? So good to see you.
Good to see you. How are you?
I'm good.
I'm here to see Mariam Dawwas. She's just escaped from Gaza with her 5-year-old daughter and family.
Let me show you this stuff first and then we'll...
We can sit here.
Let's sit here. Yeah. How are you?
Mariam is a 32-year-old journalist, fixer and translator. We first met in 2017 in Gaza when I was covering the strangulation of the territory by both Israel and Egypt and its awful impact on Palestinians. Let me first off by asking the obvious, can you introduce yourself and how you'd like to be described?
Hi, Antony. I'm really happy to be with you. It's my pleasure to speak about myself. I am Mariam Dawwas. The first thing that I want to identify myself is that I am a mom of a very beautiful young child, 5 years old, Sophie. I lived in Gaza for almost of my life.
Gaza is a 25-mile long strip of land on the Mediterranean Sea,
with a population of roughly 2.3 million people. The last time I saw Mariam was in Gaza, and she had me over for dinner, and I remember it really well. Her family made me maklouba, which is this beautiful traditional Palestinian dish, but we had to eat over candlelight because there was a typical electrical blackout, so we ate under those lights in almost complete darkness, talking about life, the world and religion.
Gaza is a very beautiful, warm place with all its vibes, and we know, like, we have friends everywhere in Gaza, you have relatives everywhere in Gaza. So you feel that every home in Gaza City or the Gaza Strip is your home.
But it's a home that many Gazans can't leave due to the blockade on the Strip imposed by Israel and Egypt since 2007.
You know, living in Gaza is unique because Gaza has its own abnormal circumstances, which we make some effort to adapt to it. You feel that it's your home. But our problem with Gaza is that to feel home and safe, it is like a luxury that Gazans don't have. It's either you feel home or safe.
Mariam survived months of bombardment in Gaza after October 7 before escaping and coming to Australia. It's the 4th time she's ever left Gaza. There's a lot to talk about, but there's one thing that sticks with me.
The population of the Gaza Strip, I'm sad to say that, but they became experts in the types of weapons used. I mean, even children.
She tells me about how children in Gaza can sometimes work out what weapons are being used in the Palestinian territory by the sound that they make.
People in Gaza know when it's Apache. They know when it's F-16. They know it's, that the drone. The drone it was becoming, over the years, like a very normal thing of our daily lives, and we are okay with it, and to the extent that we thank God if it's only a drone.
In her lifetime, Mariam has lived through 6 major Israeli offensives on Gaza. She believes the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, are testing completely new weapons on the people there.
The sound of bombing, it was like incredible. I cannot describe it. I can't find words to describe that sound because we've never experienced something like this before. I told my brother that they are using a new thing. This haven't been used before, and I was right. We knew that they have used a new kind of weapons, F-35.
These are the most advanced fighter jets ever made, and it has been confirmed that Israel has been using them in Gaza since the beginning of the war, including their use to deliver 2,000-pound bombs. I've been hearing countless reports like Mariam's of everyday Palestinians witnessing and documenting the IDF testing new technology and tools of repression on the civilian population there, and finding more and more ways to not just target Palestinians but use it as a model for other nations to follow. I've spent years investigating Israel's massive military-industrial complex, and just in case you're wondering, maybe I should explain a little bit how I got here. My story is not uncommon in the Jewish diaspora. Like many other Jews, I lost huge numbers of family members during the Holocaust. My grandparents actually fled Nazi Germany and Austria in 1939, just before the war began, and came to Australia as refugees. My father, Jeffrey Loewenstein, was born in Melbourne on the 3rd of March 1943, which was exactly the same day as his maternal grandparents, my great-grandparents, were being murdered in Auschwitz, the Nazi regime's most notorious death camp. From a young age, at a family synagogue in Melbourne, Australia, I was taught that Israel was a necessary answer to Jewish insecurity. I distinctly recall attending, after my bar mitzvah at age 13, a regular Jewish youth group called D&M, Deep and Meaningful, where Israel was praised, admired and honoured. It sounded like a pretty special place. I never learnt what the establishment of Israel in 1948 meant for the estimated 750,000 Palestinians expelled or forced to flee, never allowed to return. This history was never talked about. 20 years ago, as a young journalist, I visited Israel and Palestine for the first time.
And this is where I began to unpack the cognitive dissonance I saw in Israeli society.
The American school here in Gaza, bombed during the war.
I began to see and report on what the occupation of a subjugated people looked like.
I was going to ask, so if the settlers move in, the state would generally allow that to happen or ignore it? Or
Well, it's not supposed to, but that's what actually happens. Settlers create facts on the ground all the time.
I remember going around the West Bank with Israeli peace activists who were trying to help Palestinians farm their land. And we saw Israeli soldiers and settlers working together to physically assault Palestinians. They tried to assault us. Israeli soldiers and settlers are one and the same thing. For Palestinians, no one protects them.
With the Palestinian flag, they're not allowed to come here, but at the same time, the settlers have the right to come here to build houses, and the army is protecting them, the illegal people, the people who are breaking the law.
This kind of grim reality that I saw and was reporting on was so at odds with this kind of fairy tale version of Israel that I had been sold when I was growing up, and with the image that Israel tries to portray to the world still today.
This unique startup nation ecosystem is something that governments, universities, and corporations around the world have tried to mimic.
Proponents say Israel is known as the world's startup nation due to the country's massive tech and industrial sector. A nation that's progressive and innovative, leading the rest of the world into a bright green future.
Israel's 6,000 startups are central to the country's high-tech sector, a sector that represents 10% of the country's GDP and nearly half of its exports.
Tel Aviv and the surrounding regions have been dubbed Silicon Wadi, which means Silicon Valley in Hebrew. There are over 300 multinational companies and 6,000 startups that employ hundreds of thousands of people. But what's important to note here is that Israel has one of the most highly militarized cultures in the Western world. Military conscription for most young Israelis is mandatory from the age of 18, and what a soldier learns in Israel's defense forces, the IDF, is then put to use when they receive a job after military service in Israel's massive military-industrial sector.
High-tech companies are looking for real talent. They might be looking at MIT, Harvard, and Stanford, but now there's a new word, 8200.
Israel's Unit 8200 is the country's elite intelligence branch. Its main role is to monitor and track Palestinians, and it's the equivalent of America's NSA. Many members of this unit have gone on to develop leading surveillance and military tech startups in the private sector.
This specific unit actually already is having a high impact on innovation worldwide. Smart international companies are trying to learn from what's going on there to learn how to improve innovation.
One of Unit 8200's main goals is the mass monitoring of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, collecting as much of their personal and political data as possible. But media coverage of the unit is largely glowing. A Forbes story in 2016 celebrated the over 1,000 Unit 8200 alumni who had gone on to found their own startups. And then there's the arms manufacturing industry. Israel is now in the top 10 weapons dealers of the world, having sold a range of surveillance equipment and arms to at least 140 countries. According to details uncovered by Israeli human rights lawyer Itai Mack, the Israeli government has approved every defence deal brought to it since 2007. In 2022, which are the latest publicly available figures, Israeli arms sales were the highest on record, surging to over $12 billion.
And according to new Defense Ministry figures, the surge in demand for Israeli-made weapons is due in part to Russia's war on Ukraine. Arms sales have now doubled in the past decade.
Israel's defense industry is only growing. In September last year, Israel signed an arms deal with Germany worth about $3.5 billion, and the sale was the biggest ever deal for Israel's military industry. In 2023, exports reached a record-breaking $13.1 billion, marking the third consecutive year that sales have broken records. Sales for 2024 are likely to increase even more. Israel's dependency on the arms trade has been a fixture of the state's economy for a long time, but so much of this history is either underreported, obscured, or marked as classified by the state. This is one story that was published in the New York Times in 1986 by the paper's then bureau chief in Jerusalem, Tom Friedman, titled, quote, "How Israel's Economy Got Hooked on Selling Arms Abroad." Now, at the time, about 40 years ago now, Friedman reported that 10% of the workforce back then were involved in manufacturing or selling military hardware. He interviewed one of Israel's leading experts on arms sales, Aaron Kleinman, who said, quote, "Israeli arms manufacturers have reached such a level of production and importance within the Israeli economy that exporting weapons has become an economic imperative," end quote. Now, I have not found many articles before or since in the New York Times that have come even close to explaining the Israeli reliance on trading arms and its support of autocracies. But what's really alarming about Friedman's report, and so much other work in mainstream Western press prior to and since, is that not once does Friedman mention the Israeli occupation of Palestine or even the word Palestinian. When I moved with my partner Ali to East Jerusalem in 2016, she'd got a job with an international human rights organisation, I began research for a new book, investigating the secrets of Israel's military and tech sectors while Israel continued to expand its brutal occupation of Palestine. There's this clear gap in the way people understand Israel and its history. So in the middle of 2023, I finally released my book, The Palestine Laboratory. It was comprehensive and in-depth, but like a lot of reporting, the deeper you go, the more you begin to realise you're only really scratching the surface. Then, October 7 happened. When Hamas attacked Israel on October 7, my first response was shock and awe, really, that such a sophisticated attack could happen, that Israeli defences disappeared, and I knew literally from the first day when it became pretty clear that there was a huge Israeli death toll, that Israel would respond overwhelmingly and that this would be a moment akin to 9/11. And although Israel itself called it a 9/11 moment, my reason was a bit different. What I meant when I thought that immediately on October 7 was that the US response to 9/11 in 2001 in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere was so overwhelming, counterproductive, violent, and insane that Israel would almost certainly unleash a similar slaughter in Gaza, which would change the map. And in fact, since that day, huge numbers of people have come to me and asked, where did we get to this moment? And how are we in this horrendous situation? And the way to really answer that is to go back to history. And in fact, it's mostly a hidden history, which really begins in the early 1900s.
You're listening to the Palestine Laboratory, a new investigative podcast series from Dropsite News. If you appreciate this investigative journalism, you can support our work by becoming a paid subscriber. For a 20% discount, head to dropsitenews.com/PalestineLab. That's dropsitenews.com/PalestineLab. You can also support our work by making a tax-deductible 501c3 donation at donate.dropsitenews.com. Thank you so much for listening.
So to begin to unravel the deep militaristic roots of modern-day Israel, there are a couple of key figures and turning points in the last century that are worth really going into. Long before Israel was founded, for roughly 600 years, the Ottoman Empire ruled over large parts of the Middle East. Throughout the centuries of Ottoman rule, and then later when Palestine was under British colonial rule, Jewish people lived in communities alongside Christians and Muslims in what is now known as Palestine and Israel. But with the advent of modern political Zionism in the late 1800s and the growing persecution of Jews in Europe, Zionists from Russia and Europe began to immigrate to Palestine to establish new settlements. Many early Zionist thinkers believed that the Jewish population would not survive or know peace without a homeland of its own. And it's crazy to think of this now, but early Zionist thinkers started looking around the world for possible locations of that Jewish state. Australia, Argentina, other places. And in the end, of course, they decided that Palestine would make the most sense in their perspective. But the world could have been very different if there had been a Jewish state, for example, in the centre of Australia or in South America. To establish a homeland of its own, though, some of these early Zionists believed a Jewish nation could be forged through military might alone.
This is a society that is built around the army, that thinks around the army, and that serves the army, to a hammer everything looks like a nail. And this is exactly what happened in Palestine.
Filmmaker and historian Professor Haim Brasheeth-Zabner has extensively documented how early Zionists shaped the future of Israel's military culture.
I'm an ex-Israeli living in Britain since 1972. I was born in a refugee camp in Italy in 1946 because both my parents survived Auschwitz, the two people alone of their families, and came to Israel 2 weeks into the 1948 war. I was a baby, and basically we lived in a place called Jabaliyah, which is to the south of Jaffa, and the only people living there were survivors of the Holocaust and survivors of the Nakba.
Haim himself was brought to Palestine as a baby, 2 weeks into the 1948 war. His work looks at how the State of Israel was essentially born out of the military.
So they knew from the beginning that they needed a military organization because they didn't mean to just have a dot here and a dot there on the map of Palestine, but they meant to take Palestine over, and they said so clearly from the beginning.
Now, in early 1909, one of the first Zionist armed militias set up a group called Hashomer, meaning guardian. The group's goal was to defend new Zionist settlements for Jewish communities in Palestine.
They needed it because you couldn't settle Palestine without dispossessing Palestinians. Most of the land was tilled in Palestine, apart from in the Negev desert. So this was, in a sense, the Hashomer and anything that followed it were a set of colonial organizations to protect and to allow expansion of the projects.
Many of the founders of Hashomer later became key figures in the Zionist movement, including Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, Israel's second president, his wife Rachel Yanit, and David Ben-Gurion, the founder of the State of Israel.
Ben-Gurion, who was from very early the most important person in the Zionist Federation, he immediately understood the importance of military institution.
David Ben-Gurion, a short, balding figure just under 5 feet tall, was originally from the Polish town of Plonsk. In 1906, when he was just 20 years old, Ben-Gurion moved to Palestine and worked as a farm labourer in the new Jewish settlements. He eventually discovered he was a much better political organiser and strategist.
Now, Ben-Gurion knew that without an army, he could not take over Palestine, fully populated, densely populated agrarian society of the 19th century, which was already modernizing at quite a pace.
The founders of the State of Israel, in particular David Ben-Gurion, believed that the building of a strong armed force was critical to establishing a state and as a way to help form a new national identity among the diverse Jewish population who had recently immigrated to Palestine. Ben-Gurion believed that the nation was to be, quote, constructed through military experience, and outlined his model of a, quote, nation under arms.
He was very influenced by the Prussian state. He wasn't alone in that. Even the very left of the movement were influenced by Prussia. Many of them came from Germany, and Prussia was a model state of the 19th century. It was the strongest state in continental Europe. It was militarized to the eyeballs and successfully became the kernel of the future German state. You know, the saying was, most states have an army, but Prussia is an army, has a state. So basically this became the model. The army was there first, the state was its creation, and this is true to this very day. This is the society. The society is a society that the universities, like the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, is an army camp with a campus around it. You know, I don't know about a British or American university that has an army camp. So that's why his pioneering was not just in creating the army, but using the army as a social machinery and a political machinery to creating a state and a nation. So Ben-Gurion has laid the foundations for every aspect of Israeli life, and it hasn't changed in more than 75 years.
So how exactly did Ben-Gurion and others begin to create this nation under arms? One major factor was their early collaborations with British colonists, who took control over Palestine after the fall of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. In 1917, the British government announced the Balfour Declaration, essentially giving support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. But what it didn't do was give equal support for Palestinians and Arabs living there in the same land. Hashomer was disbanded and absorbed into a new organisation, Haganah. In the 1920s, Haganah and other Zionist paramilitary organisations were illegal under the British mandate, but the British authorities began to turn a blind eye to their activities once they realised these underground groups might be of some use to them.
The Haganah was set up as an illegal operation, of course, but the British knew of it, had agents in the Haganah to keep things going on their side of the fence, but never acted against it in the 20s and in most of the 30s. Until the 40s, there was no sanction against Haganah or the other organizations that later will be called terrorist organizations. They were, the British closed their eyes to this, and in many ways in the 30s trained Haganah and the others in fighting the Palestinians.
In the 1930s, the local population began resisting the British mandate. Palestinian groups called on the British mandate to halt uncapped Jewish immigration and settlement in Palestine, demanding the right to self-determination and representation.
The main case of the Arabs is against the British government's policy in Palestine on favoring the establishment of a national home for Jews, forgot intentionally to safeguard the civil rights of the non-Jewish population.
To begin with, they just went on strike, but the strike was so brutally broken by the British power in Palestine, the mandate government, that gradually this has developed to an intifada. So this was what the British called the Arab Revolt, and it actually was total. The whole of Palestine was on strike and striking against the British.
During the Arab Revolt in Palestine of 1936 to 1939, which was a popular uprising calling for Arab independence, the Haganah and other armed Zionists became useful collaborators for the British colonial forces, who fought to quell the revolt against the British.
The New Jerusalem, built for peace, today is the centre of turmoil and riot. British patrols in the city adopt the sternest methods to keep order. Snipers have been responsible for many killed and injured. All visitors are searched for weapons. In the heart of the city is a blazing lumberyard, typical of the outrages that have occurred.
Now the British needed the Haganah and needed the other organizations, and they actually brought it into their military forces. It was famously done by Ord Wingate, that was a veteran of the British Army, and he started training the Haganah before 1939 to assist the British later on. His methods were a bit unusual. For example, lining up a whole village, all the men in the square, and then shooting every 10th man, basically decimated the village. If they didn't give up the arms and told him who the people resisting are in that village, they would all die. So these were the methods that Haganah commanders were trained in and were part of in the 30s already.
Now, during this uprising, British forces deployed brutal tactics, which they had developed and tested during their fight against Irish resistance during that War of Independence in 1919. One tactic the British pioneered during their fight against the Irish, then deployed in Palestine, was tying Palestinian prisoners to the front of convoys to prevent rebels attacking, which interestingly enough is exactly what the Israelis often do now in Palestine, particularly the West Bank.
The police units called Black and Tan, which had a terrible reputation in Ireland because of their brutality, were brought lock, stock and barrel to Palestine to a new colonial conflict. In other words, from Britain's earliest colony, Ireland, to Britain's newest colony, Palestine.
The strategies from the British playbook used against the Palestinian rebels during this time included executions, detention of thousands without trial, and exile of their leaders.
You know, you have to think about Palestine and before that Ireland as laboratories. Those were laboratories for methods of fighting a population which is not really armed, they were fighting with shotguns and such light arms, but trying to defend their livelihood and their homes and the fields against a colonial police and a colonial force. So everything was tried out, and the British already knew, and everyone else knew, that a world war is coming. And therefore, this was a chance to try new weapons, to try new techniques, and what the Haganah was so good at learning from the British.
This collaboration between Zionist groups and British forces deepened during World War II, where tens of thousands of Jews received military training by the British to combat the threat of Nazi Allied forces. Now, at the same time, new skilled arrivals who had fled from Germany and Austria were helping industrialise the cities in Palestine. And here weapons, made by local plants, proved invaluable for when Jews wanted to establish their own nation after World War II in the ashes of the Holocaust.
From Palestine, first pictures of the latest bomb outrage. Jewish terrorists blow up the Goldsmith Officers Club in Jerusalem. 13 Britons were killed and 16 injured. Total casualties on this one day of violence was 18 dead and 25 injured.
Jewish militias began launching attacks against the British forces and against Palestinian villages, forcing thousands to flee.
Britain answered these attacks by putting whole cities under martial law.
The situation escalated into a full-scale war in 1948, resulting in the permanent displacement of more than half of the Palestinian population and between 15 to 20,000 dead.
Latest camera records from Palestine show heavy damage in and around the Arab city of Jaffa as Haganah troops move up to new positions along the war-scarred roads. Jaffa itself has become an almost deserted city.
The Palestinians refer to this as the Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic.
Victorious Haganah troops have driven the Arabs out of the beleaguered city, taking many prisoners. Few pitiful refugees rescue what few belongings they can.
With the end of the British Mandate and the British forces departing Palestine, on May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion stood up in Dizendoff House in today's Tel Aviv and declared the independent state of Israel. What I found living in Israel and Palestine, and really what I still see in much of the Jewish diaspora, is profound denial about 1948. You see villages which were ethnically cleansed in 1948, and one that stands out particularly, my partner Ali and I went to Lifta, which is on the outskirts of Jerusalem, and no one lives there anymore, and nature is taking over again the old homes, but you see this quite eerie old village, people's homes and old shops, which are falling apart, but this is one of the more visible signs of what 1948 meant.
The events of 1948, of leaving my home, my city, my country, and going into exile, I didn't, of course, understand it as exile, I just understood it as leaving, with nobody able to tell me when we were going home, when we were going to return, was terribly traumatic.
Palestinian historian and writer Ghada Karmi was a child living with her family in Jerusalem in 1948. After Zionist snipers set up posts in evacuated Palestinian houses near her home, her parents decided to leave until things died down.
We had to leave rather hurriedly, and we got a taxi with enormous difficulty because it was so dangerous. And my mother had packed one suitcase for all of us, my brother, my sister, and my parents, because she believed that it wasn't for long and we'd be back soon. And so we left on that morning in April. And little did I know that we would leave never to return.
The Nakba really is ever present within Israel. And I would argue, in fact, it's ever present in many settler colonial states. The equivalent here in Australia, the genocide that people often don't want to talk about, or in the US with Native Americans, or in Canada, or in New Zealand. In every country that had outside colonial forces come in forcibly and try to destroy the indigenous population, that history remains still buried. But within Israel itself, that happened really in a human's lifetime ago. We're not talking that long ago. And I think the echoes of the Nakba still resonate today, and they feel very alive, in fact, for a lot of Palestinians.
It's repeating. It's not the past. It's not a past. It didn't happen in 1948, and now it's different. It's the same. It's the same way. It is the same atrocities. It's happening again in front of the world's eyes, and no one is doing anything.
Mariam's own family, the Dawwas, were displaced from a town outside of Gaza in 1948.
The Dawwas family comes originally, we are refugees, we're not Gazans. So I come from a town called Herbia. It is near the Gaza Strip, but it's considered in Israel. It's called Yard Mardechai now. And I'm originally from there. So I was always educating myself about what happened in Nakba, how did it happen? And I always had a question when I see the massacres of Deir Yassin and the many other massacres. I've always asked myself a question. Where were the world?
Palestinians and the rest of the world are still dealing with the ramifications of 1948. But the death and mass displacement in Gaza alone since October 7 is actually worse than that of the 1948 Nakba. And that leaves me with a key question. What does that say to the long-term ramifications of this current moment? For Mariam and other families in Gaza, not only is history repeating itself, but the Palestine Laboratory is accelerating.
It was planned, it was designed for Gaza to be used as a workshop. There's a funny thing that I want to tell you about. I get offended, really I get offended when I buy makeup and personal hygiene products. It says it doesn't test on animals. So I feel that even we are not privileged like the animals. It's painful that I'm saying this, but the world is okay. It's okay with a state, an occupation that is testing weapons and killing people with its arms, and then market that. They say that it's been already tested on Gaza.
In the next episode of this series, we'll deep dive into exactly how Israel's military industry markets its hardware to governments across the globe. We'll look at the secret deals that have been made with dictators abroad for decades and meet the people fighting to uncover the truth about Israel's history as a major arms dealer to some of the world's deadliest regimes.
General Pinochet, how would you evaluate the success of the junta to date?
De éxito completo.
Complete success. Can you predict when the power will be returned to the people of Chile?
Es una pregunta que la hacen todos, señorita.
That's a question that everybody does.
Palestine Laboratory Podcast is hosted by me, Antony Loewenstein. Throughout this series, we discuss and reference a number of different Israeli companies. We reached out to all of them for comment. One got back to us, the rest didn't, and you can read more about this in the show notes. The series is produced by Elle Marsh and Bethany Atkinson Quinton. Production and sound engineering by Tim Jenkins. Studio recordings at 2SER in Sydney with Michael Jones and Jonathan Chang. Field production by Cinnamon Nippard. Original music in this series is by Ara Kofax, and music direction by Sunless Studio. This last track is Coup d'etat by Use Knife, remixed by Mukata. A special thanks to Anu Hasbold, and to my friend Mariam Dawwas for telling us her story, providing invaluable testimony and an eyewitness account of the reality on the ground in Gaza. You'll be hearing more from Mariam in later episodes. You can find full credits and links to relevant resources and further reading on the podcast website, including information about Haim Brasheeth-Zabner and Ghada Karmi's work. This is an independent podcast brought to you by Dropsite News. To support Dropsite's journalism and get 20% off a subscription, visit dropsitenews.com/Palestine Lab. Thanks for listening.